Hey everybody, this is Hiram Sims coming to you live from the Sims Library of Poetry. And today I wanted to just record a very condensed version of the lecture that I gave on Wednesday night called How to Read a Book the CLI Way. So much good information was given, and so I want to make sure all of you get it in a way that you could uh, receive it. So I'm going to share screen with you, show you a couple slides, and then we will get into it. So one of the first things we talked about was the definition of community, which means a unified body of individuals, the people with common interests living in a particular area, the group of people with a common characteristic or interest living together within a larger society, a body of persons of common and especially professional interests scattered through a larger area, a body of persons or nations having a common history or common social, economic, and political ties, an interacting population of various kinds of individuals in a common location, joint ownership or participation, common character, likeness, social activity, fellowship. So when I talk about reading a book every week, which is what we ask you to do in CLI, ultimately, I'm talking about learning about a community. It's a community of authors. And so you are a group of people with a common characteristic, living together within a larger society. Like all the authors don't live on the same street or in the same place, but ultimately, we all have this thing in common, like we love to write. And oftentimes in the CLI classes, we love to write poetry, and we want to gain a love for reading poetry and what we can learn through it. So it's not just about read a book to be smarter. It's read a book so you can learn more about the uh, details of your community, right? The community of authors. And so many of you remember this from when you interview for CLI, but we ask people to study the background of the writer first, then after the background, learning about the intellectual property, meaning what did they make? And then you're going to read one book from that intellectual property. And then after you read it, we want you to find out about the opportunities that the author got a chance to take advantage of. So the bio, BIO, background, intellectual property, and opportunities that the writer got a chance to take advantage of. This just kind of reaffirms that order to read the biography, in doing that, reading the cover, the spine, the back cover, the copyright page, then read the poems, and then afterward look for that. So I'll probably revisit these slides right after. So the example text that I want to use today is a book called The Weary Blues by Langston Hughes. So someone donated a 1927 edition of this book to the Sims Library of Poetry, which I'm holding in my hand. So this is the book that I have. And before I open the book, I'm going to go find out about the author, right? And so my favorite place to find out about the biography of authors is the Wikipedia page. And I know a lot of teachers hate to use Wikipedia because anybody could add something to it. But I have just found it to be one of the best sources of biographical information. And typically I like to look at this, and then I'll go to like biography.com or Poetry Foundation and look at more biographical information. So I just want to read the first paragraph and we'll see what we can gain from it, right? It says that Langston Hughes was an American poet, activist, novelist. He was one of the innovators of something called jazz poetry. I'm going to pay attention to that. He's best known as a leader of the Harlem Renaissance. I'm going to pay attention to that. He grew up in a series of Midwestern towns, a prolific writer. He moved to New York as a young man. He graduated from high school in Cleveland, studied at Columbia, where he dropped out. I'm like, maybe I should figure out what happened there. He first published his poetry in the Crisis magazine. I want to learn more about that. Uh, he eventually graduated from Lincoln University. He uh, let's see, also published a great deal of work in a weekly column called the Chicago Defender, right? So this is not even before I get into like all of this other stuff about his life. But just looking at that information, that gives me enough to like go in search of more information from, different things that were mentioned in this article. The first thing that I want to look at is the first publication. That it also mentioned that he got a Guggenheim Fellowship at a young age. So I'm going to keep that in mind too. So the first thing I want to check out is the crisis. Um, so the crisis, I learned, is uh, the publication of the NAACP. It was the first publication that they created. It was created by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1910. And so he began to, share all of this information, news about what was going on, in Black America, eventually the Civil Rights Movement. And he began to also publish literature and essays. And so he published most of the Harlem Renaissance writers before they became famous writers. He published Langston Hughes, he published Claude McKay, he published, Zora Neale Hurston, he published Countee Cullen. And so this was like a premier publication, and they had national distribution. They had a distribution of over 800,000. So if you got your work published here, all of a sudden, like Black America was reading your work. So I found that to be, great information, right, about the crisis. Then I looked up the Chicago Defender. And what was very unique about what they said is that the Chicago Defender, he had a column there. So that means he had uh, control over the writing that got published in that column. So not only was he publishing his work, but he was publishing the work of other Black writers in Chicago. Langston Hughes moved to Chicago and got a job working for the Chicago Defender. So when I looked it up, the Chicago Defender was the Black newspaper. It also started in either 1910 or 1915, and they were, communicating the lives of Black people, what was going on in Black Chicago. He also put on other poets in his column, like Gwendolyn Brooks at a very young age. So between the age of 13 and 16, Gwendolyn Brooks published like 75 poems. A bunch of them were published in the Chicago Defender. So I just found that to be like golden information. And the Chicago Defender still exists, right? The Crisis is no longer the NAACP's newspaper, but they have a different publication that's online that current writers could submit to, right? So, those are just a couple things that I found out about. So it said that he also, well, I guess I'll talk about that a little bit later. All right. So um, now that I've learned a little bit about his biography, and of course, I would read everything, right? The next thing I want to look at is his intellectual property, because I really want to find out, like, the book that I'm reading, like, where does it fit in his actual life? And so when I look at his bibliography, first of all, I just noticed that he's published many, many books then of poetry. And this is his list of novels and short stories. And this is his list of nonfiction. This is his plays. These are his children's books, right? So to me, the message that I get is that Langston Hughes was a writer, right? Not just a poet, but he was also a writer. And so the book that I'm reading, The Weary Blues, was his first book published in 1926 by Knopf. And so that's another thing I pay attention to when I'm looking at the bibliography. I'm paying attention to the publishers because the there's information there, right? If he published with Knopf in 26 and then again in 27 and then again in 32, that lets me know that he sold books, right? And they wanted to keep publishing. He published again with them in 1942, right? So always good to pay attention to who's publishing the work, right? And so um, I'm going to look up, I'm just going to keep that in mind, right? And so let me stop sharing screen with you. So now I'm going to read the book. So I'm reading the cover, the Weary Blues, the spine, and at the bottom it says Knopf, right? So when I go inside the book, I'll go to the full title page, and it says that it was published by Alfred Aynoff, right? So that's his publisher. So now I want to look that up, right? Like, who is Alfred Aynoff, and is Alfred Aynoff still publishing books? I assume that he's dead because Langston Hughes is dead, right? So if I look that up, go to Knopf books. Yep, spelled that wrong. But so I found out through looking this up that Knopf books used to be called Alfred Aynoff, founded in 1915, right? And they were publishing lots of different types of books, but also published a lot of the Harlem Renaissance writers. And as I scroll through, I find out that Alfred Aynoff is still publishing books, right? 106 years later. I know this guy, Kevin Young, right? And that book had to come out a couple of years ago. So they're still publishing writers and perhaps still publishing great Black writers. They also published Toni Morrison. They also published Angela Davis, right? So, I would love to be published by them. So I might look and see like how can I get, published, with Alfred Knopf. So then when I read the copyright page, it says, it was copywritten in 1927 by Langston Hughes. And it also says that it has this Library of Congress publication data, right? So those are two words that I've heard, but I'm not entirely familiar with, right? So first I want to look up that Library of Congress data, right? And I'm like, why do almost all the books I read mention the Library of Congress on the copyright page? Turns out that the Library of Congress is the largest library in the United States. And one of the requirements that they created many years ago is that every single book published in the United States has to send, every publisher has to send a copy of that book to the Library of Congress. And I was like, really? Right? Every single book published in the United States, you are supposed to send a copy to the Library of Congress, right? Turns out that they're the largest library in the world, that they have 163 million books, and that they have poetry readings at the Library of Congress. And I can go, visit. And maybe, in a perfect world, I could set up a reading there, right? So these are all like opportunities. And guess what I also found out? My book was published in 2013 by Figueroa Press. I looked up the catalog. My book is there at the Library of Congress. So, right. So all that to say, these are all like elements of knowledge in the community that, you can learn about. Then, like the copyright page. I was like, what is copyright? Who controls that? So the Copyright Commission is an office uh, of the federal government, and they uh, control copyright and patents. And so as I scroll down, if I want to get my book copywritten before a publisher publishes it, I can click on this link and register my works with the Library of Congress, and it's only $35, right? So to me, that's, golden information. So now, after learning all of that, now I'm going to read the book, right? So I read all the poems. All the poems are fantastic, right? And I have a greater sense of Langston Hughes' style, his subject matter, the things that he was writing about when he was in his 20s, right? So now, after I read the book, I'm going to go back to the Wikipedia page to learn about the opportunities that he got a chance to take advantage of. And when I do that, I find out when I look at honors and awards, right? Because that's really where a lot of the opportunity is. I found out about the Guggenheim Fellowship. Then I find out about the Rosenwald Fund. I find out about the Spingarn Medal that he won from the NAACP. I found out about these honorary doctorates, right? That a university could give you a doctorate without you ever taking a class there, right? But what I want to focus on is the Guggenheim Fellowship, because I've heard of that, but don't know a lot about it, right? Turns out that John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation every year for the past 100 years gives money for artists to travel and work on a particular project. And that today, if you get a Guggenheim Fellowship, it's around $43,000, right? Imagine what you can do with $43,000, especially if you go to another country, right? Like you could, probably go to El Salvador and write poetry for a year on $43,000, right? I don't know about LA though. That's not going to take you very far. But uh, yeah, any of you can apply for a Guggenheim Fellowship. Why not, right? So, um, so after I learn all I want to learn, then I'll move on to another book. So let me just like review all of the things that I've learned just by reading one book, right? I read 100-page copy of The Weary Blues, and I learned about the Guggenheim Foundation. I learned about the Copyright Commission. I learned about Alfred Knopf Publishing. Um, I learned about the Chicago Defender, which still exists. I learned about the Library of Congress, which still exists. I learned about the Crisis newspaper, which still exists. And I learned about Langston Hughes's life, right? So when you read a book that way, like the knowledge that you have increases. I didn't just learn about Langston Hughes, I learned about the community, right? The community of authors and opportunities that they got a chance to take advantage of. Best believe, soon as I get my tax refund check, I'm going to the Library of Congress, right? And and maybe while I'm out there, I can go visit Knopf Publishing in New York, um, and check out the Copyright Commission and all of these other, great things that you can learn about. So that's what we talked about. And I just want to encourage you to read every day and write every day, because that's the bookmaking habit. And it's about making space and room in your life for your writing. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.